Welcome to 1775. Happy New Year. If it's a bit late for 2025, then this is definitely, from our point of view, the beginning of 1775. Tonight is the first of 5 concerts we're presenting over the year, exploring the music that was being written in 1775, exactly 250 years ago. 3 of the other 4 will be very largely Mozart dominated. The exception is a program in September where we're exploring some of the lesser known operas that were written in that year. I have a short list of about 14 operas, which I will whittle down between now and the summer. Tonight is, I love putting these programs together because it's sort of deliberately not Mozart-centric, just a sort of overview of a sort of top of the pops of each particular year. And actually, I didn't realise until quite recently, and it's a slightly frightening thought given how fast time flies, but it's 10 years ago this month since we embarked on Mozart 250. So today is the launch of our second decade. So in that time, obviously, Mozart has turned from an 8-year-old to an 18-year-old, and the quality of the music has grown exponentially, obviously, as it would, from anyone doubling in age. In the first 10 years, we've covered exactly 50 composers. So we've featured music by 50 composers, including Mozart, so 49 others, including his dad. And we have 2 more tonight. We begin with one of a large number of symphonies by a guy called Carl von Ordonez, who I'd always assumed was Spanish. I knew the name, but hadn't really heard any of his music until I started programming this concert a year or 2 ago. He's actually Viennese. He was born in Vienna and spent his whole life in Vienna. I don't quite understand this. His father was French, and he didn't want to have a French name because it made him look like a foreigner in Vienna. So he took his mother's maiden name. But his mother was Spanish. So I can't really work that out. He was born, his French father was a member of the minor aristocracy, and as a result, it was deemed inappropriate for him to pursue a full-time career as a professional musician. So he squeezed all his musical activity into his spare time. Very prolifically so. There's a record, Charles Burney, the famous English musical historian, visited Vienna and attended a string quartet concert in a private house. That there's a quote from his memoirs in the program tonight, and he refers to the string quartet playing impeccably, and the second violinist was Ordonez. He was primarily a composer of symphonies and string quartets, over 50 of each. And he wrote 2 symphonies in G minor, one of which we're performing tonight. Now, I've never quite worked this out, but all the lesser composers of the 18th century that write symphonies in G minor, they're always incredibly good. And I don't know whether people just saved their best for G minor or whether it's actually very difficult to write a bad symphony in G minor. I don't know. But we've done, as well as obviously G minor symphonies by Mozart and Haydn, in the course of our journey so far on Mozart 250, we've performed G minor symphonies by Johann Christian Bach, by a composer called Beck, again, who I didn't really know very much, and a remarkable G minor symphony. And both of the G minor symphonies by Ordonez are really very good and interesting. I mean, I think that the choice of minor key immediately makes it feel more dramatic, more tragic in a way, more sort of sad, more soulful. However, this symphony is quite interesting. It's not as sort of archetypally Sturm und Drang as a lot of these works. There was this in the 1760s and 70s, there was this generic movement which was not called Sturm und Drang at the time, but was subsequently dubbed Sturm und Drang. And there was basically this trend as a reaction against the sort of Rococo niceties of the sort of mid-18th century. People wanted music to mean more and say more and wear its heart on its sleeve a bit more dramatically and urgently and with more anguish and self-expression. So there was this sort of outpouring of really quite tempestuous music across these 2 decades. Both of the Ordonez symphonies in G minor are not entirely typical. I think there is still something, well, it'd be interesting to hear what you think after hearing this symphony tonight. It feels to me still quite steeped in the Baroque. It's not sort of, you wouldn't necessarily know that Beethoven was anywhere close if you listen to this music. But it is very, very lyrical, very soulful, but in a more wistful than angry, certainly. It has a very unusual feature in the middle of 3 movements, as well as the string section, and often at this time, at the middle, the slow movements, we're not allowed to call them slow. Musicologists are always saying they weren't slow, they're medium rather than fast. But the so-called slow movement of this symphony, the middle movement, these were often scored for strings only as a sort of palate cleanser and also to give the wind players a bit of a break. But in this case, it is scored for strings only, but there are 2 solo viola parts that play do their own little duetting, in addition to a third viola part. So there are 3 independent viola parts, and I don't think I've ever come across this in anything in 18th century repertoire. And it's a very soulful, honest, deep sound world. The whole piece it's not massively ambitious. It's probably a quarter of an hour, maybe slightly under. But again, just a really fascinating insight into what was going on when Mozart was writing. I mean, it's so easy, and on one level true, to say that Mozart was totally timeless and his music transcended history in a way. It was this total, extraordinary one-off. But he was always, and I think we always come back to this in this long-term survey that we're doing, he was absolutely a child of his time, and all the music being composed, almost whether Mozart was familiar with it or not, tells us so much about Mozart's world and what he copied, what he moved away from, what he deliberately rejected, and what he was influenced by either deliberately or unknowingly. All these things sort of create this wonderful texture. I do have a bit of a golden rule, however, that anything that we program, I'm not allowed to program. I've set myself the challenge of never programming something just because it's historically interesting. And in fact, when I have been tempted to do that, I've quite often come across something in a book or delving in a library and said that would fit perfectly in a program. And then when I come to actually explore the music isn't actually good enough. Or there was a piece a couple of years ago that did something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a Salieri piece that did a little trick, a sleight of hand, that was exactly what Mozart did in one of his Da Ponte operas. And I thought, we must include that. And when I looked at the music, it was 6 minutes of sort of proving one very tiny little footnote of, Mozart wasn't the first to do that. And I thought, I'm not going to inflict 6 minutes of sub-level music just to make that point. You could easily just mention in the program Mozart wasn't the first person to do that. So I am quite assiduous at trying to make sure that everything we program has value, interest, and enjoyability on its own score, not just because of its relevance to Mozart. So that's our opening tonight, and then we move on to, in a way, we stay in this sort of area of stepping out of the Baroque. The only composer, clearly tonight, who was actually born in the 17th century. Hasse was far more famous than even the 19-year-old Mozart in 1775. He'd written many operas. He was one of very few Germans, or indeed very few foreigners of any nationality who had gone to Italy and made a very successful career of writing Italian operas in Italy. Italians were convinced that Germans were incapable of writing properly Italian operas. And he became known as Il Caro Sassone, the dear Saxon. And they sort of slightly took him to their heart, and they permitted him to receive all these commissions that would otherwise be going to Italian composers in the big Italian opera companies, opera houses. He did something with his opera career, which I think maybe several other composers would have been advised to do the same. In 1768, he wrote an opera called Per amore Tisbe, which in fact we performed here 7 years ago or so. And he felt that opera was the best of his work. He was satisfied that he had finally written an opera that did full justice to what he had inside of it. He therefore decided to retire. He said, great, done it. I'm not going to write any more operas. Very admirable. Unfortunately, he was 2 years later, the Empress Maria Theresa convinced him, and he couldn't really say no to her, to come out of retirement to write one of a pair of operas to help to contribute towards the celebrations of the wedding of one of her children. So he wrote his final opera, Ruggero, in 1771, and the other opera, as part of this pair, was by the 15-year-old Mozart. And the public response was that the Mozart was much better than the Hasse. And rather than having a huff and having a chip on his shoulder, like many of Mozart's contemporaries did, Hasse took it all very gracefully and predicted very significantly, symbolically, that this young man will consign us all to the rubbish heap of history.